On Thursday at 6 p.m. at Donovan's Club, Sort and Lounge are bringing Rupi Kaur to campus, which is a really great opportunity, so come check that out. We're now accepting submissions for the Allegorical Athena, which is a literary arts magazine dedicated to issues of gender, sex, sexuality, and intersectionality. And you can submit art, writing, or any other creative work to WMST at colgate.edu. And then WMST 202 classes are screening films on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. So tonight there's a screening of Mosquita and Mahr, and you can see a schedule on posters in the center, and everybody's welcome to go to that. And then we know we changed up the setup for this soundbite, and it'll become a little bit more clear why shortly. But if you have to leave during the middle of the presentation, please just do so quietly and clean up your things around you. We have compost and trash cans in the back, and if you do have chairs that are out and you took one out when it wasn't already set up before you got here, then if you could just please put that back when you're finished, that would be great. So today we have Professor Creasap and Jake, who will be introducing, and I'll also say something too about Zines. So I'll pass that over.
Hi everyone, my name is Creasap. I'm a visiting professor in SOAN, sociology. So some of you are here because you are making zines for my social movements and sociology of gender courses. So hopefully this will give you some insight into the project. And for those of you who don't know what zines are, hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about what they are, what they look like, and by the end you'll get some hands-on practice with them. So how many of you have heard of or seen zines before? Okay, many of you. So I'm just going to give, in my presentations, just a brief sort of history, very brief history of zines. I'm also going to talk about how to use zines as teaching tools. So for those of you who are teachers in the audience, or peer educators who might be interested in using zines, this will hopefully give you some ideas. And I've also left some resource pages around the different stations with a list of resources, and I'll talk a little more about those at the end. So to start with, what's a zine? So here are some examples. These are basically non-commercial, non-professional, small circulation magazines, so zines being derived from magazines, that creators produce, publish, and distribute themselves. And this, of course, has gotten a lot easier than it used to be. People distribute them online. When I started looking at zines, they came through the mail in sparkly, glittery envelopes that you sent away from record stores and bookshops. But they really began in the 1930s with sci-fi fans whose interest in science fiction was not represented in literary magazines. And so they would write about their favorite stories and circulate those stories and commentary about them in zines. The second kind of wave of zines was during the punk rock era of the late 1970s, early 1980s. Again, this is punk rock fans who were not seeing the music that they liked represented in music media, would create their own media and distribute that amongst one another. And then finally, what many of you in this room probably know about Riot Grrrl zines from the 1990s. So Riot Grrrl began as a small movement in the Pacific Northwest, a music movement, and that generated a lot of independent publications, ephemera, flyers, etc. They're still passed around today. Feminist scholars link zines to other waves of feminism. So here on the left you see scrapbooks, the late 19th century. So suffragists and women's clubs use scrapbooking as a means of documenting their activities, reporting on things that weren't reported in the media, correcting media reports about them, and would pass these scrapbooks around. On the right, you see this is the Black Women's Manifesto from 1972. And this is available. I'll give you a link to where this is available. Actually, my social movements class and I are discussing this one this afternoon. And so, in the 1960s and 70s, of course, these movements produced a huge amount of ephemera, zines, pamphlets, mimeograph flyers, newspapers, all sorts of print media. And so, feminist scholars link zines to these traditions within feminist movements. So for my purposes, I was looking at zines as an opportunity to create a more creative kind of writing assignment for students who were in my Introduction to Women's Studies course. And this began in about 2011. And I was thinking about, it was a writing intensive course, so students had to produce a minimum of 30 pages of writing over the course of the semester. And I was thinking, how can I make this more creative for them, and how can I make it that I don't have to sit and read 120 research papers at the end of the semester? And so I thought, maybe zines, right? So women's studies is much more freer, and the sociologists really like standard social science research papers. And I felt a little bit freed up by teaching in women's studies, more so than I did in sociology initially, although I do this in sociology now. So when designing this project, I really had 3 principles of feminist pedagogy in mind. The first one is, of course, critical thinking, something all of you in the liberal arts institutions should be very familiar with, right? So the Zine project was an exercise in developing critical thinking skills about categories that are taken for granted as natural, so womanhood, heterosexuality. And the Zine project required students to analyze their own biographies and experiences through the lens of queer or feminist theory. Participatory learning. So the course was set up around a series of workshops where we divided the zines together. So the first workshop, we went to the public library. This is at the University of Pittsburgh. And the public library had a large collection of zines. I think something like 1,500 zines at the time. It's grown since then. They have their own librarian, zine librarian at the public library. Yeah, so it's grown substantially since then. But we would go, the librarian and I would pull zines that related to the course about feminism, gender, body image, queer theory, etc. And students could just look through them and sort of familiarize themselves with the zines, which you can do here. Obviously, you see, and Hannah's going to talk about the zines that are available here. And so that was the first stage. The second stage, students started writing. There was peer review throughout the course of the semester. We had several workshops built into the class. And people really, really contributed to each other's work, even though they were writing individual zines. And then the third is validation of personal experience. So many students found the zine making process to be intensely personal. And they talked about things in the workshops and wrote about things in their zines that they hadn't necessarily talked about with other people, or hadn't thought about in a sort of critical way before. So these were 3 sort of principles that were guiding this project. The objectives, then. And this is a fabulous zine, if any of you are teachers. This is a zine that we used as a reading assignment in the course. The first one was to use feminist or queer theory as a lens. And so in order to get students to do that, we did this in several ways. So first we would look at sort of different kinds of media and ask them to apply these theories, obviously, as a lens. And I would present zines as reading assignments, so they could get a sense of other people who were doing this, and that this wasn't just sort of a class-based assignment, but this is really kind of built to the zine form. And the second was intensive writing about theory. So this was designed to show that they can comprehend, apply, and evaluate academic theory, but write in a way that general audience or anybody in the public library could understand. So at the end of the project, they had the option to donate their projects, donate their zines to the public library, and it would be cataloged then as part of the zine collection in the public library. So this allowed students to take the assignment really seriously, because they were thinking like, oh, anybody off the street can walk in and pick up my zine, so it has to be really, really good. And so they put a lot more work into it. What presented a quandary for me was how to grade zines. It's very antithetical to the zine ethos, to the DIY ethos, and so I felt a little bit guilty as a zine maker grading people on their zines. So how I kind of came to terms with this was that I graded them on their writing. That's what the assignment was intended to assess, right? So I graded them only on their writing. They had to produce at least 10,000 words in their zines, which is the equivalent of 8,000 to 10,000 words, which is the equivalent of a research paper, but in zine form. I didn't grade them on their drawing skills, their poetry, the form, or any of those other things, only on the writing. And so there were 4 categories for assessment. The first one was organization. Is it organized? Is it coherent? Does it flow together? Most students wrote zines that had a series of essays. It wasn't just one long essay. And so did those essays sort of complement each other? Did they flow well? The use of class concepts, so showing me that they used some of the concepts that we had discussed over the course of the semester: solidarity, intersectionality, various other concepts. Analysis and evaluation. So that was the major of the objective of the assignment, that students use feminist theory as a lens. So I was looking for that lens in their writing. And finally, creativity. And this was rated the lowest because, as I said, I didn't want to give too much grading time to creativity. But they had to show some creativity, of course, to make it a zine. So, as I mentioned, I partnered with the Carnegie Library. After they were completed, the students had the option of donating them. Roughly over the course of 3 years, 70% of students elected to donate them to the library. The other 30% really fell into two camps. One, they felt insecure that their zines were not as good as those of the other in the public library, and they felt insecure about that. And mostly it was because they were very personal and included family photos, personal narratives that they didn't want to be made public. So the zines that I'm going to show you from my students were made public. They were donated. This semester, incidentally, so the way that we don't have obviously a zine collection in the library, but I am working with Jessie in the library. Jessie, right over there. Library liaison. We are meeting soon to discuss how we can incorporate some zines into the library here, and how we can display some of the student zines that are going to be created in my courses this semester, and by the other students who are here at the center. And also, the center is building a collection here, so there's certainly access here in terms of zines. So there were really two kinds of zines that students created. The first kind is experiential zines, what I call experiential zines. And these were really dealt with personal issues, body image, sexuality, family, but through the lens of feminist theory. And so this is from a zine titled Color Me by, what did I call her? Rebecca, which is not her real name. This is just the first page. So it's a kind of diary form, and she creates a lot of personal photos. And she writes, quote, "The title Color Me signifies the range of emotions that I explore in this zine, which is a personal meditation on life through the lens of intersectionality theory." So the first essay in Color Me, which you see the excerpt of here, is a reflection on the politics of hair. So she writes, quote, "I'm sure for most people cutting your hair is far from the biggest deal in the world. It lacks controversy, does not impact your daily life. However, for any woman that has black ancestry, this is a different story." The essay begins, end quote. The essay begins as a diary entry on July 16th, 2010, and that was the day that she went to the salon for, quote, the big chop. She writes, quote, "A term used by African American women for the process of cutting off relaxed or permed hair when transitioning from chemically treated to natural hair," end quote. "My dad was kind of upset and asked, 'Why would you cut your hair without my permission?' To which I retorted, 'I didn't know I needed permission to cut my own hair.'" She goes on to write about standards of beauty and whiteness, the effects of colonialism and slavery, is the dislike for anything does not reflect white European standards of beauty, etc. And she goes on from there. So in this way, she's connecting history, biography, race, gender. She points out how normative beauty standards are historically linked to whiteness, acknowledges that she was socialized to believe in those standards by her family, and so she links her family connections in with her narrative. And by, quote, "going natural," she asserts her belief that natural is beautiful, and, quote, "it is both an act of defiance and self-acceptance." So she's linking their ideas of solidarity, resistance, family, race, gender in this personal zine. So this is an example of the experiential zine. The second group were cultural zines. And these were people who didn't write necessarily about personal experiences to them, but used feminist or queer theory as a lens for analyzing pop culture. So this was authored by Cassie, it's her pseudonym, and she was the editor of our university satirical newspaper. And so she used satire as her method for writing her zine. And so she writes about the Madonna for archetypes, which those of you intro to women's studies are probably discussing. And she writes in the style of the satirical feminist self-help book. So the form reflects the content of the zine. If you look here, you have on this side, "Let's Get It On, a single girl's guide for living," and she gives a whole series of tips here. So we have similar pages for dressing, acting, walking, etc. If you flip the zine over, you have the other side. Never gonna get it, a single girl's guide for living. So she uses the form of the zine to mirror the concept that she's writing about. In the middle of the zine, the pages sort of go back and forth. So one's upside down, the next one's right side up, and so you don't know which, are you reading the Madonna side or the horror side? You aren't sure. And she's making a comment on how those binaries typically run into each other and blur those boundaries. So she used the form of the zine as much as the content of the zine to really kind of make her point here. There are some limitations to this assignment, those of you who are teachers. The first one is that it's very time consuming. So take heart, students who are writing zines this semester, this will take a lot of time. It looks, I think the students who are up here can attest that it's not as easy as it looks. It takes a lot of time. So start soon, like now, or today, in this workshop. This is very, very time consuming. It requires a lot of class time to sort of build in workshops and other things. And it requires a lot of student time outside of the class to sort of put zines together too. So that is one limitation. The other is the student population, and this doesn't apply so much to Colgate, to other universities where courses are much larger, so 50 to 100 students. How do you have each student make a zine? It's extremely time consuming, especially for the faculty member has to work one-on-one with each student on their project, and so that can become an issue as well. And finally, access to zines, which could be an issue here, but isn't really, right? Because we have this collection building here. And so I'm going to give some solutions to all three of these. The first one is resources, and these are included. Some of these are included, and then there are a whole bunch of others on the resource sheet that I pointed out. The Queer Zine Archive Project has 1,300 zines, hard copy zines that are, some of those are available online. Quite a few I think are available through there online, right? The POC Zine Project, People of Color Zine Project, they also have zines, there are fewer that are available online through that site. However, I worked with this collective. They came through Pittsburgh and came and did a reading and a discussion with some of my courses. And so we were able to sort of connect with them, and they're very, as a collective, very responsive to requests. So if you see a zine on their title list, they're happy to send it to you or photocopy it out to you. Women's Liberation Movement Print Culture Database, which is at Duke University. So if you're interested in historical zines from the 60s and 70s, you can find a lot of pamphlets, mimeographed copies, and other manifestos there. And Microcosm Publishing, which is arguably the largest zine publisher in the United States. They have an exceptional catalog of zines. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of zines. Also, I wanted to plug this weekend, if anyone's going to be in New York City, the New York City Feminist Zine Fest is happening. And actually, this is a great event. Has anybody been before? So this year is at Barnard College, which has one of the biggest zine libraries in the country. Jenna Friedman, who's a zine librarian there, is one of the key organizers. And she has been instrumental to the zine collection in Pittsburgh, where I was working as well. She's been helping the zine librarian there. And this year, actually, I'm really happy that the work that I started with my students, the connections between the library and the Women's Studies program, has continued. And this year was the first Feminist Zine Fest in Pittsburgh, and she was instrumental in that as well. So it promises to be a great event because she is one of the organizers. So if you're in New York on Sunday, I recommend it. And then finally, for classes that are big, even 25 students, it's kind of a lot of work to do the zine project. So one way around this is creating collaborative zines. And so some of my colleagues at other universities have had students collaborate together in small groups. Each student writes 1 or 2 essays, and then they put them together into a collaborative zine and present them. This year, my students are doing individual zines, and we are actually going to, I'm just bringing this on them now, for a colleague of mine, my course is called Gender and Power. A colleague of mine at the University of Mississippi is teaching a course called Sex and Power. And so, miraculously, our classes meet at the same days, at the same time, so we're going to Skype them together and see the zine project plays out in each of those courses. So that'll be a fun kind of way of seeing how this has traveled and seeing what other student populations are doing. And I think that they're writing collaborative. This is a larger class. So that's all I have to say. Who wants to go next?
Hey, so I'm Jake. I am a junior here at Colgate, and I'm here today because I make some zines, and Hannah and Kim wanted me to talk about what I find empowering about them and why I make them, and why I see them as like a really useful tool. And so I guess I'll start, so like last semester, Hannah will talk about this a little bit, but she started instituting the zines here in the Women's Studies Center and started doing some zine workshops. And I think the thing that I was most readily intrigued by was the ability for zines to be a simultaneous like art project and social movement project. And kind of like the link between being able to be creative while also being able to be critical. Because I think a lot of times we spend a lot of our energy thinking critically, but we don't always have a creative outlet that can double as like a source of self-love and self-care. And so I thought that was really important for me. And I also find art and creativity as a really effective way for me to express my thoughts and my ideas. I think that a lot of times we relate critical thinking and academics too much, and that can be really limiting. And so I started making some zines just kind of for fun, and they were just about like random things. And then I think I started really understanding the greater potential that they have, and I think one of the most inspiring things for me about zines is their accessibility, that they're really physical, you hold them, they pop, it's like black and white or color, and there's clip art, and so they're really intriguing to look at. They're not academic at all. You can use whatever language you want. There's no censorship. And I think that's really refreshing sometimes, especially when you're trying to communicate ideas. Especially as students, we read so many articles and books, and we listen to so many lectures, and I think sometimes it's really helpful to kind of shift our mindsets a little bit. And it's really refreshing to read something that's not laid out in like an essay form, but rather just kind of like spits ideas at you. And I also found, so on campus, I co-lead Lambda, which is an LGBTQ organization on campus. I'm involved with Yes Means Yes. I do a bunch of stuff, and I find that a lot of times in those spaces we have really good conversations, really great conversations, but those spaces also double as safe spaces. And so the conversations sometimes don't end up leaving the rooms. But a lot of people outside of those spaces need to hear those ideas and need to hear those experiences, and I find that zines are a really productive way to let those words and those thoughts leave the room while keeping identities safe and confidential. And it also allows you to present ideas in a manner that doesn't necessarily lead to like an argument. I think a lot of times it's really hard when you like feel vulnerable enough to share ideas, but then someone is like really ready to attack them, and then you have to be ready to back them up. And so I think zines provide for like a really awesome opportunity to just kind of give someone information, and you don't have to worry about what like what their response is and what your response to that response would be. All they have is what you give them. And so yeah, I found zines really helpful for that reason. Sorry, I keep dropping all of the zines. And then so recently, at the end of last semester, I started making a like concurrent zine under the title of Glam. Some of you may have seen them. They've been wandering around the coop every so often. There's like 4 or 5 issues out right now covering a slew of topics. And that's been really fun. Some of them have been experiential zines where I talk about like some really personal experiences. The first one I ever made was called Boyfriends Are for Straight Girls and Girlfriends Are for Straight Boys, and I talked a lot about my frustrations with using terms like boyfriend and girlfriend and dating and what that means as a queer person, and like if I'm even allowed to use those words, and when I use them, if they mean something differently than if someone else uses them. And then the last scene I made is how to be a period positive person as someone who doesn't have a period. Because I think that's one I've like been wanting to make for a really long time, and was like just figured out the words for and just figured out how to do it. And that was a really liberating experience for me to be able to take these thoughts that have been running in my head for a while and then finally get them out there and be able to present them to people. And very, very recently, I've had a number of people reach out to me interested in helping, so we're looking to make this zine a collaborative effort. So hopefully it'll be a larger publication in the near future, and you'll see more of them. Yeah. I think Sarah, you want to talk a little bit?
Hi, okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly so that you can start making zines. But basically, I'm the Women's Studies Publications intern, and so this kind of project started when I was working with Monica over here and Allie, and we were basically working to bring more zines into the, because we're basically working in the library, and that's mostly been Monica's project, but in thinking about kind of how to, like basically how are like the books in the library still limited to academia, and still like to publish those books, like there's certain politics behind that, and so what I understand zines is like historically rooted in resistance to mainstream media, and also as being used in social movements and like, as kind of like resisting, which people already touched on, like mainstream ideas and censorship, and I think like you can conceptualize zines as starting like almost even like before sci-fi, and also like as existing outside of just like waves of feminism, if that makes sense. So also like with zines, people who are making them are creators of knowledge and producers of knowledge, and so in that sense it's like also challenging who is able to produce knowledge and who is seen as educated, like, or if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying like they should be used to like it's the onus is on people who are making zines to like educate everyone about their experiences, but it's more that like it is an outlet to say things that like otherwise are like censored or are like harder to say in certain spaces. And so like that's why I really appreciate zines, and it doesn't have to be just language. It can be, a lot of it is art, some of them are entirely visual, some are entirely text, and some like play around with both of those, and so that's something you'll get to explore soon. And then we also have, in our library, we have a lot of different zines over here that like Monica, Ali have been working really hard on to bring here. And so I just picked up a few just to show you titles, and you can look through them at any point in time. This one is, also a lot of these are online, like Professor Creasap was saying, and there's also a website called Issue, where you can like find any of them, and you can also upload your own, like you can scan them and upload your own zines online, so that you're basically like self-publishing and getting it outside of just like a cold gate or whatever spaces that you're a part of. So this one's called Borderlands: Tales from Disputed Territories Between Races and Cultures, and it's a sequel to Mixed, which is basically a zine that features like true stories by mixed-race writers. And then we have one about activism through zines, mindful occupation, rising up without burning out. There's one about vagina monologues, one called Mad Mulatta, and then there's another Borderlands one, and then we have a bunch here, and Professor Creasap is letting us use some from her personal collection, which is really cool. And then we also have this book, which can also like provide some context if you're still interested, and it's called Zines in the Third Space, Radical Cooperation and Borderlands Rhetoric. And so that's some of our resources, but then basically throughout the center, this is why the setup is different. We have different stations for you to make your own zines, and you can basically make them as a part of a group, and then, or on your own, you can make it about whatever you want, but we have some topics if you're kind of looking for a more specific direction. Or for inspiration, we have those topics for you. And then also the idea behind this is that everybody makes like a page or 2 pages, and then we put them together. It's kind of like a large community zine that can be in the center. And then also if you want then like a copy of it, or if you want to like have your own copy. We'll give it back to you, but basically the idea, unless you don't want us to have it and copy them, you just keep it. But basically, like, the idea is that you make it, we'll scan it and like make a large community zine, and then everybody can kind of like see the fruits of your labor. So yeah, and then also just to, because I think sometimes new mediums seem more intimidating than they actually are, and a large part of zines is supposed to be like hands-on, do-it-yourself experiment. So we have some templates in different stations, and but also blank paper if you want to do something on your own. Basically, we're gonna do zines like of this size, so you just would fold the paper in half, and each side, like you basically, since we'll be photocopying them, just do them on one horizontal side, but you would fold it in half, and like for example, each of these would be one page. So just keep that in mind. Or you can also experiment with that and make something where it's like if it opens up, you'd see something in the middle of it. But yeah, so for you to be creative. And then the topics around the room, if you can stay to the one that you're close to, or make up your own thing too also. But they're basically, and also think about them in relation to like your own personal identity, like from many different intersections of like race, class, gender, ability, sexuality, and then how that factors into this, if you're making it from personal experience, or if there's something you learned about or want to like learn about and then write it about, you can also do that. So the topics are queering education, student activism, and like for example, we were thinking about that is like 5 things people on campus can learn from student activists on campus, and that's another thing you can think of if you're limiting, if you feel limited, is like how could you make a list, for example, of like different things that you want people to know, like 5 things you want them to know about X topic, or would be creative. And then we have respectability, politics, language, media, spirituality, definitions, academia, and production of knowledge. And yeah, so we're gonna play music, and you can talk to each other, come up with ideas, make your own views. If you have questions, we'll walk around.